He's deeply interested in the power of our physical selves that they have over our existence, and he's very socially motivated. He gives of his time once or twice a year to go to Vietnam to help people out there. He was educated at Cornell and at Stanford. He's a professor of surgery at Dartmouth Medical School and also a professor in the Thayer School of Engineering at Dartmouth. And his practice in medicine is heavily influenced by his dual role as a professor of engineering and of medicine at the Ivy League institution. He asks very hard questions. His first major was in philosophy, but not only for the sake of philosophizing, but because he's working tirelessly to advance the healthcare field. Dr. Rosen counsels the Department of Defense in Washington, D.C. on bioterrorism and polytrauma, and has worked on a National Academy of Science committee that predicts virtual reality's effects on healthcare. He studies how technological advancements in communication can help deliver healthcare to more people in more places. Dr. Rosen is a wonderful, wonderful human being, a great, kind and gentle man who can sit at your dinner table and you realize at the end of the meal he's drawn very accurate portraits of all the guests at dinner on the table napkin. According to Dr. Rosen, there is still a great room for discovery. The key, he has been quoted as saying, is to ask questions, not know the answers. I want to discover, he says, what we're not seeing that is going to surprise us. Ladies and gentlemen, please make welcome Dr. Joe Rosen.
Brian, thank you for that wonderful. Brian, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. The title is Human Wings, and because human wings is a metaphor in surgery, in my field of plastic surgery, for being able to see better. When we train people to be plastic surgeons, we say, can you fix a hand injury? Can you remove a tumor and reconstruct a face? But can you build wings in the back of humans? Because the process of thinking about and imagining putting wings in humans allows them to think beyond today's surgery into future surgery. It allows them to be creative in the creative process. It allows them to visualize things they wouldn't normally visualize and think of solutions to questions that they ask. So we can restore humans, and we continually try to restore humans, whether they're blown up in the battlefield or they're hurt in a car accident out front. And we can begin to think about going beyond restoration of humans and think about how do we make you not only be healthy to the age of 30, but be healthy and live a vital life to the age of 100. So this talk is about learning to see better in surgery and how you might apply that to your own fields. Here you see in these pictures wings, whether it's in art or recently someone strapping wings on their body and not jumping out of a plane and pulling a parachute, but an Italian having wings like a flying squirrel and flying out and then landing without a parachute, which happened in 2007. So over the years that I've given this talk, we've moved from 500 years ago where people would jump out of buildings with crude wings by Da Vinci and not survive to now that we can do it. And this talk is all about learning to see better. So here's a map of humans, and it's a map that asks questions and doesn't necessarily provide all the answers. It's a map that shows the human body physically, in terms of behavior and biomarkers. We're going to talk about the physical body, behavior, and genomics in this talk today and try to provide for you a greater map of what it is to be human. So to start with that, I want to sort of change the paradigm. We always think that humans are a good design, but what if our present design is not a good design? What if we could redesign humans, such like an artist would do, and provide better beauty, better brains, better body, and change human re-evolution. So that this picture you see on the right says to be 100 years young. By changing all those parts that fail, we can actually go in and improve them so that you can live a healthy life for much longer years. So to do this, we're in an art museum, and what if I was an artist rather than a surgeon designing a human? How would I do it? So you can see an artist palette there, but what's interesting about that palette and the tools in the palette, it includes things like a surgeon's hook and a scalpel, and it includes tissues like muscle, fat, skin, and bone. And we can use these elements that we can either transplant, move around, or grow to enhance beauty, brains, and body. Now, one of the analogs that I use to help in creativity is to look at other creatures. And an interesting creature that helps us do better human design is an insect. Because an insect design has an exoskeleton like body armor to protect it. It is so beautiful often that we take insects and use their shells for jewelry. And an insect often is designed a lot like an automobile in the sense that the insect has body armor, certain kind of sensors, and other things that we don't have. So when we look at this beetle as ideal, you can see this car in the bottom where we compare this beetle to a car and there are very similarities. And then you see a bug on the bottom left, which is kind of a Defense Department bug, which has electronics on it to track it. And we can see this beauty in both these beetles and in this Bugatti in terms of human design. And a lot about this museum here that we're at in Toledo has to do with design and design elements. And we need to include that when we think about ourselves, and we even think about that in surgery in terms of when I reconstruct a face or a hand or some other part, the notion of beautiful design. So here again we see human design versus cars. A car has an outer protective shell. We provide that for soldiers in the battlefield with body armor. Cars have wheels for mobility. We often provide humans in cars, but now we have exoskeletons, robotics, to help humans move faster. We have cars with space for storage, and we have navigators in cars, like we have phones for humans. And we have all these different elements that we begin to incorporate into humans to improve what it is to be human, that we take naturally now. In fact, leaving the airport last night, there was a family, a father and two sons, and all three were on their iPhones, sort of glued to them. And the big question on the way to the rental place was whether or not their batteries, and whose batteries would wear out first. So we really changed what it means and how we define what it is to be human. So again, the overview of human design: what is the best material? Flesh, things like skin, muscle, bone, robotics, artificial materials, or even virtual reality. Imagining what it is to be human, so that if I wear Google glasses and I look at you, you provide over Wi-Fi an image of what it is to be you. And I heard at NPR the other day in Google Chat that this already goes on, that in Google Chat, I can change what I look like when you look at me. So really these things are influencing what it is to see and be a human. But remember, being a human is multidimensional, as I said with that map. Being human is not only the physical presence, it's our behaviors, and ultimately it's our genome, which not only determines some of our phenotype, what we look like now, but our genome changes what our future generations look like. And I'll get into that in terms of nanosurgery. So when we look at this ladder on the left, these are the things we do in the 20th century, where we reconstruct people, operate on them. But in the 21st century, we add things like transplantation. If you lose your face, we can put a new face on you. We can regenerate tissues and grow an ear, a nose, other parts. And we can do nanosurgery. And in nanosurgery, we can go in and operate on your genome and change not only you, but potentially your future generations, redirect evolution. And that'll be towards the end of my talk today. So I'm going to take you on a voyage through what it is to be surgery in the past, the present, and the future. And a key to that surgery is how we see, how we help our students to see better, and how we visualize what it is to be human. So here we see deformities caused by injuries. On the left, a severe burn of the neck. In the middle, breast cancer. And on the right, a congenital anomaly, elephant disease, and how we can use surgery to help correct these. But present surgery is still inadequate. So we have to be creative in how we think of new solutions to modify these, using regenerative medicine, like in the burn on the left, to grow new tissue, or use transplant to remove this entire face and give this person a new face. So surgery goes very far back. If we go back 2,000 years in India, one of the punishments when you lost a war was to have your nose removed and your hand removed. So the potters, not the surgeons, would design a flap on your forehead and bring it down and make you a new nose. And that's what's diagrammed on the right. Now the potters would take clay and make a nose and then flatten it out and put it on the forehead to design the nose and bring it down. Or some would take a leaf from a certain bush and put it on your forehead and cut around it and bring it down with its blood supply to make a nose. So all these are really very close to art. And I know you heard a talk on pottery yesterday. So pottery, sculpture, design are all very closely intermingled and have stayed that way for a long time. Now, Brian talked about my work with the wounded warfighter. So I've been involved since the wars began in 2001 with treating our wounded veterans in several different ways. But one is operating directly on them. So this is a patient from Walter Reed who had a defect where most of his midface was damaged from a bomb going off, an IED, and had to be reconstructed in stages. And some of these images will be a little difficult to see for some of the audience, so I just want to warn you. But this is the kind of injuries that we now get that our soldiers now survive. So you can see this surgery where in the upper left we take forearm with skin and bone and we shape it and redesign it like a sculptor. And we take the bone and soft tissue and build a foundation in the mid-face. And when we do that, we have to move it from one part of the body to the other and reconnect its artery and vein to reestablish its blood supply. And then we go back 2,000 years and we design a nose on the forehead and bring that nose down and make the soldier a new nose. Now the initial nose that we make is a very bulky nose because we have to put cartilage and bone into the nose to establish that. But like a sculptor working on a material like marble, we then carve it down and reshape it until we get a reasonable looking nose. Now we don't take this person and make them look normal again. We just make them look human again. So the question is, how do we go from here, where we're limited with our present techniques in the 20th century, and how do we go beyond that? And my work in Washington has been trying to bring up grants and money to support the notion of face transplantation. So if there's a defect like this, we can replace this defect by removing a face from a person that's recently died and putting that face on this person. And you can see how visualization helps us understand what we do. Because not only do we visualize a defect, but we in fact use virtual reality to visualize the operation step by step. We practice what we're going to do in cadavers and then in virtual images and create models of the face with its blood supply, look at the bone, and step by step practice the surgery in a virtual environment that I'll talk to you about, and I think the following talk is also on. And in that environment, we practice what we're going to do. So here we see a beautiful girl down the left who was in a car accident, who had her face burned off. And after multiple operations, like 15 operations, here you see the result in the bottom right, which is really unacceptable. So what do we do for people like this? In the past, we were really limited by our present techniques. So we can remove the entire face from someone that's recently died, the way we remove a kidney or a heart. And then we can take that whole face, peel it off with its arteries, veins, and nerves, and then put it on someone else. The first one of these was done in France in 2005 on a woman who had her face chewed off by a dog. She became unconscious and the dog chewed off her face, you can see in the upper left, and then she ended up in the bottom right with the first face transplant. In 2008, we did a similar thing for a woman that was shot by her husband with a shotgun and replaced her face. And you can see in the images on the right, all the different parts that get replaced. And you can see how this visualization of the face and its muscle, skin, and bone and vessels helps us to take a very complex problem and plan it out and execute it. And again, this was supported by Defense Department money. Its AFIRM is the Armed Forces Institute of Regenerative Medicine. And then I worked very closely with Harvard. This is Bo Pomahawk with Elof Erickson in the back. Here they are harvesting a face. So in the 21st century, we can harvest a face and then put that face onto this person that was burned severely on the left, was then reconstructed, as you can see in the middle, although that's really an unacceptable reconstruction, although it saved his life. And then finally, we can transplant that face, as you see on the right, to give him at least a human-looking face. And I saw him a few weeks ago in Boston, and now it's been revised, and it looks even more human. So now there's been about 20 of these face transplants done around the world, and the goal is to be able to use these for soldiers that have their faces blown off during war. But what if we can't do a transplant, or we're limited by the donors available for transplants? Can we grow a face? So one of the major efforts in the military that I've been involved in is regenerative medicine. Can we take cells from different parts of your body and build a framework or a scaffold, harvest cells and put them into that framework, and tissue engineer parts of the body? And this work was first done by Tony Atala at Wake Forest, and he grew bladders in 10 children. And those bladders were then placed in using stem cells, a scaffold or a framework, other elements to replace parts that are missing. So this is a real revolution in tissue engineering and regeneration. And Langer and Vacanti are the ones that trained Tony Atala. And it's an interdisciplinary field that applies the principles of engineering and life sciences towards the development of biological substitutes that restore, maintain, or improve tissue function. And it's very interesting. It's interdisciplinary, and one of the problems with interdisciplinary is to get all these different fields to see the problem in the same way. And I was at a conference last week at Dartmouth, and at that conference we talked about interdisciplinary education of our students and the importance of visual learning in helping each of them see with the same languages. And visual literacy and being visual literate is critical to all these different fields working together. So we can end up moving from down on the left, where we grow a human ear-like structure in the back of a mouse, actually growing a human ear for a soldier that's lost it in the battlefield. And one of the key things to regenerative medicine is to use stem cells that are pluripotent cells, meaning that we can take that stem cell and in the right environment, we can change that stem cell into any kind of cell. And on the right, you can see a diagram of all the different specialties, from clinicians to engineers to material sciences to biologists, that need to come together and and share their language and visualize a problem. In the center there, the problem is to replace a jaw, and all work together. And what better way to work together than to visualize a problem in similar ways and all work together in a network to solve these problems. Now what's key to this is a stem cell. In the bottom left you can see that cell. And here's a cell, like a student, that under the right influence we can change it into a heart, nervous system, or immune system. It has the ability to be any of these things under the proper influence. So this is revolutionizing and will revolutionize the future of surgery and much of medicine. So how does this get applied? Because we ask the questions, how does it get applied? So on the left, bottom left, you can see a soldier burned severely. And how would we help this soldier? So we imagined that we could create a biomask. This was a concept done on a piece of napkin, like Brian says, I'm always drawing. I'm in Vietnam with a colonel from the US military, and he and I drew this on the back of a napkin in Hanoi, Vietnam, and said, what if we could make a biomask that we could put on a severely burned face, and then using regenerative medicine, robotics, virtual reality, grow a face on this patient. So if we can envision it, then we can do it. So since that time, we've funded this project to use all these different tools in engineering and biology and art to help us begin to replace a face by growing a face in situ, growing a face on a patient with bioreactors in that mask to reestablish and restore the face that's missing. So let's go back to my original concept about wings. 500 years ago, Ambrose Bierce wrote a book about monsters and marvels. Monsters are people that are born with deformities. Recently, I had a little baby born with a cleft lip, and I reconstructed this lip in a 2-month-old to make it look normal again. So I took this monster, although it's a beautiful little baby even with a cleft lip, and made the lip look normal. But marvels, according to Ambrose Bierce, is the notion of a human with an animal part like a wing. So even 500 years ago, there was this notion of marvels, or chimeras, humans plus animal parts. And how would we do something like this? So this gets back to artistic surgery. And there was a fellow named Tom Krizik in plastic surgery. And when he would give board exams, which I'm doing next week in Phoenix, and the resident would come in and say, what question do I need to answer? Is it a cleft lip? Is it a syndactyly of a hand? Is it reconstructing a missing breast? He would say, no, on this piece of paper, I want you to draw how you would step by step put wings on the back of humans. Now the response to that in our field was to fire Dr. Krizik from ever giving the exam again. But what he was trying to do was help us to see better. So Tom was really ahead of his time with visual literacy, saying, if I can help these young plastic surgeons see better, then they can solve any problem. If they can put wings on humans, what problem can't they solve? So how would we learn to make wings? So let's say we take the experiment and do that. Are humans capable of flight? So Leonardo's tried to build these wings 500 years ago. And we can, with modern techniques, build wings using bioengineering, 3D printing, and make wings very much like bird wings, very light, and fabricate them in many forms. But how would we do them for you? So the first thing we would do is take an expander or balloon like the ones we use for breast reconstruction and put them between skin between your arm and your body, like it shows on the bottom left. And then we would expand them up to get extra skin. Although I've had some women come in that weighed 400 pounds and lost 300 pounds, and they come in and they say, Dr. Rosen, they hold their arms up and they say, I have bat wings, can you get rid of them for me? So I always say, I specialize in bat wings. And then you could, like in the upper left, put ribs in them. And I tell my undergraduates at Dartmouth that you may not get a job when you finish at Dartmouth, but if you end up becoming a painter, and I make these bat wings for you, and you fall off your scaffold, you can glide to the ground safely like a flying squirrel. And then in 2007, you can see this person flying down. So we can now start thinking about doing this, but the importance isn't so much what we do with it in terms of making wings. The importance of what we do with it in terms of being surgeons or just human, in terms of envisioning things and imagining things. So learn to make wings, we can augment human performance. So we can not just stop with restoring humans to what they were before, but we can go beyond this. So is it ethical to make true wings? Probably not. But how is cosmetic surgery different than that? Someone comes in who's totally normal through the aging process, or through a nose they don't like, and we change that. Where do we draw the line? If they come in and decide they want a tail, I've had a number of patients wanting tails or other parts. Is it okay for me to say, come on in, I'll make you a tail? If they want horns, should I make them horns? So where do we draw the line here? So what do we learn? What is the best design for humans? So here's a device to measure that. Can we really measure that visually, what the best design is? Of course we can. If we want to know what the best design for humans are, we come to a museum like this and we learn how to see, and then we decide for ourselves what beauty is. And beauty is very different, as I'll show you in the rest of the talk, between one society and another. Very different societies define it in different ways. In America, it may be that larger breasts is more beautiful. In South America, it may be that a larger buttocks is more beautiful. It's very strange between different societies how we make those decisions. So let's talk about cyberspace. Jaron Lanier, who's a friend of mine, decided to invent an entire world, a virtual world, in which he could play musical instruments that can't be designed or played in our physical world. So creating a new visual literacy in a world that doesn't even exist was some of the beginning thoughts on virtual reality. And I was involved in this work in the 1980s, where for NASA we were developing virtual worlds to design the space station. And then in the bottom right you can see the applications of these virtual worlds to medicine, to business, to the military and simulation, and even to flying. So that now you can go into virtual games and imagine yourself flying around in the world. So here's a picture of Jaron on the bottom left playing a musical instrument. He has the largest private collection of musical instruments in the country. There was a rumor that after 9/11, which damaged where he was living, he took all his musical instruments and put them in a tractor-trailer truck. He drove them across the country, and along the way there was a small musical museum that he bought the entire museum and took that with him out to Berkeley. So he can play all these instruments, but again, his goal was, can he create worlds that he can envision with gravities and things that are of other dimensions, and create in those worlds. So what we did back in the 1980s, Scott Fisher, Jaron Lanier, and myself, was to begin to build these worlds with NASA so that we can explore other worlds. And one of the notions was building a simulator, like this Link simulator in the bottom left, to learn how to fly. In the middle, you can see a simulator of the human body. So we could create models of the human body to allow us to do surgery and practice surgery that we hadn't done before. So we didn't have to have you come in and operate on you for the first time in a new procedure, but we could practice the procedure over and over again until we got it right. And on the bottom right, there's the first example of Scott Fisher and Scott Delp doing a tendon transfer in a leg to practice it before we did it. And everybody during their career gets their Andy Warhol 15 minutes of fame. So in the Chicago Science Museum, they had this exhibit there, and I went there with my family. Of course, it was a computer exhibit, so it wasn't working, so there was a yellow tape up saying, please do not go through this. I went under the tape and ran down to see it, and the security guards chased me right to the exhibit. And then I said, the guy on the left there was me, and this is my 15 minutes of fame, and this is the work that I did. So they said, you can stay here for a few minutes and look at this before we take it down. So that was at the Science Museum in Chicago a number of years ago. So my wife suggested that I put this slide in, and I did, and what we have done is created models of the human body that allow surgeons to navigate in the body and practice operations. So the bottom left is your knee after an accident. It allows us to visualize your knee in multi-dimensions, from the shape to the forces, to decide how best to reconstruct a ligament. And the right, that's me when I was 40 with our startup company, navigating inside that knee so that we can practice doing surgeries that people hadn't done before and get it right. And since then, this has been used to allow people to reconstruct many different inside parts, where it used to be we had to do it from the outside and open people up. Now we can navigate inside the body with these virtual worlds of internal arteries and kidneys, and work in there and get it right before we have to operate on you. Now, where do we go beyond this? So 20 years ago, our students said, how do we tell a patient what's going to happen to them before it happens? So on the bottom left is a virtual model of a cockroach. We talk about bugs. But on the bottom right is a model of you, like Michelangelo's David, where we can amputate a toe and see how David would walk afterwards. Because we have patients that come in and we say, you're missing your thumb, and we can take your great toe and transfer it up to make you a new thumb. And they want to know, we're excited about that, but what about walking afterwards? And we can create this virtual model and let the patient visualize what their walking will be after the operation. And here you can see the original Muybridge pictures from Stanford from over 100 years ago. And then you can see this Michelangelo's David with his foot again, where it can walk and show you how it walks after we do surgery on it. So this notion of allowing us to visualize ourselves after surgery and what the effects are. Now, there was an interesting movie out at one time where the director got so tired. The director got so tired of the actresses that he basically created a virtual actress named Simone, simulated one. It was a great B movie, but fun to see. And so this virtual person would act like that. And there's a famous Turing test. And if people don't know about the Turing test was a test where someone would put a human behind a screen and a computer behind the screen and ask it questions to see whether it could differentiate a human from a computer. It came out of an old Victorian test where they would put a man behind a screen and a woman behind a screen and ask questions to see if you could differentiate. And we thought of a notion of a virtual reality Turing test where we had a real human and a virtual human, and could we tell the difference? So what would the differences be between those two things? And can you visualize those differences and interact through all the different senses that Brian Kennedy has presented to you during this conference. And that's something we haven't realized at this point. So Jaron Lanier, 30 years ago, said, well, if we had this, and we had these glasses on, like Google glasses, then we could look like whatever we wanted to someone else, which is fascinating for a surgeon, because right now a patient comes in and says, I want to look younger, I want my nose to look different, and I have to physically operate on them, which seems pretty crude. But what if that other person was wearing glasses, and I was wearing the Google glasses, and I could project an image to them? How would I change what I look? And of course, Jaron didn't stop there, and he said, well, you could, in your virtual Turing test or your view, you could be as creative as possible. So the ability to look, not just get on and wear different clothes that day, but completely change your appearance, really opens up what you can do in virtual reality. And these were Jaron's notions years and years ago, but now we're starting to see these in things like the Google chat rooms. So when we go back to what we talked about earlier in nasal reconstruction, you can put a leaf on a forehead and cut around it and make a nose. You can make a clay nose and flatten it out and put it on the forehead and bring it down. You can computer simulate that. Or you could, on the bottom left, you could be wearing glasses and then view that person without a nose or with a very disfigured face. And instead of doing a face transplant, you can envision whatever face they wanted. Now, I used to have this slide for 2050. Yesterday I changed it to 2025, and it just seems like it keeps getting sooner and sooner. So finally, in the last few minutes, let's talk about something which is really questionable in terms of ethics. Can we change our evolution? It's one thing to come in and say, I want to change myself, I want a tail, I want horns, I want bigger ears. I've got all kinds of emails from people about that. I had a Harper's article back in 2001 that said I would be a radical surgeon and change things, and everyone's emailed me ever since, and my wife keeps the emails about all the things they want changed. But what about changing your genotype so that future generations, your descendants, would also be changed? So first, the very interesting one-page article from over 50 years ago was the discovery of the DNA double helix. So this was imagining the information in a visual form that determines who you are. And you can see these images on the right, and you can see this image here of the DNA molecule, the double helix you recognize, and then on the right, the double helix on end, which you often don't recognize. And that's the information that determines the unique characteristics of everybody in this room and all the creatures basically on the planet. So we have a phenotype definition, which is the way we look on the outside, and it's determined partly by nature, partly by the genome, and partly by nurture, how we're brought up, in which civilization. And you can see these images, which might be images in the museum, but people dress very differently. I was looking in the audience, and this audience isn't as creative as these pictures. I'm surprised. You come to a museum, you think you'd want to dress your best. And then I've been to West Africa and other places where people do more body modifications here. And then there's beauty in African scarification, these more extreme forms to us. But when they look at us and they see us doing breast implants and other cosmetic surgery like facelifts, they see us as pretty extreme. And finally, when you look at cosmetic surgery and you start looking at this 100 years ago and someone came in with a large nose and wanted to change, that was seen as very extreme initially. And now it's obviously common day. And will 25 to 50 years from now, we see someone coming in and wanting something like wings, will we see that as every day? Or what kind of changes? Will we put in brain implants to improve the way we think? So Brian Kennedy on the way over was talking about people that only use 10% of their brain. If I could put a device in your brain that allowed you to use 50% of your brain, would you have that device? In my undergraduate and graduate work, I looked at brain-machine interfaces, which seemed far-fetched in the 1970s, but now we put in brain implants in people that are paralyzed from the neck down, so when they think, they can move a robotic arm. So changing your genes, genetic engineering. What's the ethics of human design? Could we mix our genes with other species? If we mixed our genes with other species, then we could grow things like wings. You could grow other things. Would it be okay to do that? You'd not only be changing your genes to grow other things, you might even be able to regenerate things faster. So if you look at this salamander, a very special kind of salamander, if I cut off its limb, its arm, it regenerates as an adult a completely normal limb with all its fingers or toes in 42 days. So rather than trying to replant that arm or transplant an arm or grow an arm with regenerative medicine, this thing naturally regrows its own arm perfectly in 42 days. But you can do better than that if you take genes from spiders and put those genes in goats. Then their milk produces a spider silk with one of the stronger characteristics of any material that we know. So we can suddenly mix genes from one creature to another and grow things that we've never been able to grow before. So nanosurgery, the ability to operate at the genomic level, begins to open all these things up. And this isn't what we do right now, but will be when this talk is given in 25 years. I once gave a talk on robotics, and that part I haven't put in this talk today. And when I finished my talk on robotics, someone from the audience got up and said that, Dr. Rosen, I know you graduated from Stanford Medical School. And he said, I graduated from Stanford Medical School in 1938. So I figured the guy was at least 100 years old. He said, and that was a wonderful talk, he said, but if I would have heard that talk in 1938, they would have arrested you. So things are really changing very rapidly. And as I try to predict the future, as a futurist, it just seems like the dates get closer and closer. So one of our previous deans of engineering, Lewis Duncan at Dartmouth, gave this talk called Destiny by Design. And he looked at all the things that determine what it takes for you to live to be 600 years old. And we keep changing those things and looking at how we modify our bodies to be able to live very long. And they involve surgery, robotics, virtual reality, genetics. Each provide opportunities for artistic design, which is what the Toledo Museum is all about. And what's the measure in ethics for creative artifice? And that's all about, in my mind, seeing better through things like virtual literacy. So I want to thank the members of this association and Brian Kennedy and the museum for inviting me to give this talk. It's been a huge challenge for me to do this talk. So I've thought a lot about it. Many weekends I've thought about it, to think about how my field is affected by this. And one of the questions Brian asked me on the ride over, I said to my wife, let me go over with Brian to see if I can get some last-minute thoughts about this talk. The question is, so what? So what that we know visual literacy? So what that we put visual learning into our undergraduate education? And the so what is that as a plastic surgeon, visual literacy enables me to be a plastic surgeon. It enables me to create. It enables me to be a surgeon in the hospital, that if anybody in the hospital has a problem they can't solve, they come to me, and I have to sit down with my little sketches and try to think about how I can solve this problem, how I can look at things differently. And to me, being an artist and art has always been a challenge that allows someone to see the world in a new way. So the artist's role in society, like the philosopher, is the role of being able to see the world in new ways, so that the way you see the world is different between before and after you viewed that art. So thank you again for allowing me to give this talk.
You actually reference ethics. So my question is just simply if you would speak to the ethics of these future developments.
I think the last year when we gave our class in the spring, the wings talk was given by somebody who explained in detail how you could make wings. And the second talk that afternoon was someone who basically just does ethics at Dartmouth. And there are a number of ethical questions. One ethical question is, in a world like the world we live in, where there's so much poverty that a third of the world doesn't have clean water, should we be spending our resources on putting wings on humans when we should really be spending our resources on improving water? We had a talk yesterday, right before I came here, by Rita Caldwell, who's the world's expert on cholera. And to solve cholera in the world that affects 7 million people a year, all we need to do is provide clean water. So we look at resources that we're spending. We should think about how we divide it. When I go to Vietnam, I have 2 missions. One mission is to provide very advanced surgery to a few people, training their people. And one mission is to treat diarrhea and influenza-like diseases, which have an immense effect on people in the country in Vietnam. So we have to remember that every dollar spent and every minute spent could be spent a different way. And then we also have to think about ourselves. So when Louis Duncan talks about doing all those things so you can live to be 600, he asks you one question at the end. If you want to live that long, are you willing to, if you want to have children, are you willing to kill your parents? Because we can't let everybody live that long, because we'll overpopulate the earth. So it's interesting questions that we start raising about population, resources, and all those things. And we sometimes think that we live in a world where resources are infinite, but they're not. So when I make a decision when I go to Vietnam of how I'm going to spend my resources there, people say, well, isn't it a little bit odd that you spend so much money to go just do one operation where you transfer a toe from a foot to a hand, which changes a child's life? I said, no, I like to do that, and it's very good for the child. But at the same time, I think about how I can improve epidemiology and water resources in that country. So there's a balance that we have to go. Neither one is right, but in America sometimes we don't balance that properly. And I think it's important for the students who are going to be responsible as leaders in the future to make those choices wisely. Did I answer your question? Because sometimes you have to be careful, because I spent some time in Washington, you ask a question and I give you the answer to the question I wanted you to ask. You gotta watch that with your comments.
Joe, speaking of Washington and various projects that are taking place, you've been involved in, I don't know how much you can talk about this, but reconstruction of battles and sites of killing. You've also been involved in reconstructing the Boston bombing. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So when you look at the Boston bombing and the way it was done, you learn a lot about what they were thinking when they were doing it. And the notion of having two bombs and that street that I've studied where you have two reflective walls. So not only do you have a blast that occurs which injures a number of people immediately, but you have blast waves that occur from the bomb, and those cause brain injuries that can come up later. So we're starting to study some of the victims to see whether or not there are injuries that weren't seen. So they're not physical injuries, but they're injuries that can be long-term in terms of the waves that come off of the blast, that bounce off the Boston Library and bounce onto the other walls. And people are caught in those blast waves, and they may not immediately recognize that, but down the road, they may be affected by that. So in our society, as we see these blasts more commonly in America, but certainly we see in our soldiers that have been deployed, many of them come back and they physically look fine. They haven't lost a limb, they haven't lost their face, but they've lost their life in the sense that they have permanent cognitive dysfunction, which is called traumatic brain injury or sometimes PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which may come from their continuous repetitive exposure to blasts. So in situations like Boston bombing, we study the individuals, like someone that's lost a limb, they may have trouble wearing a prosthesis. So you see a great picture of someone wearing a prosthesis and running around, but they can get problems fitting that prosthesis in pain. So we funded studies to allow you to put fat into the stump to improve that. So we fund studies to look at that. But we also look at long-term injuries so that we can be better prepared after a blast in America to warn people they may have secondary effects. Because everyone collects for the Boston Marathon, then goes back home to Toledo, Ohio, and they go in to see their doctor 6 months later and they say they have some memory loss. The wife mentions that he's been very angry and he hasn't been deployed in Iraq. He's a marathon runner. Why would he have any of these things? And it may be related to that blast, so we need to get a better consciousness of the effects that occur from these. And we can model this, we can visualize a lot of this. There are people in astrophysics at MIT that can create complex mathematical models of not only the street and how the waves go, but of your brain and how your brain absorbs the different parts of the wave. So it's very interesting, different ways we can visualize things using mathematical models that help us then to predict what we need to be worried about. Just like yesterday, Rita Powell was talking about cholera, can look at visual maps of water temperature around the world and how it goes up in certain areas, and then predict within a month or two, you'll have a cholera outbreak. And then she can go back to the British records for 150 years and see how well this matches cholera outbreaks to water temperature. So it helps us not just to look at what happened in the past, but it helps us to predict for you or for a health department what they need to do, what's coming next, which is often good to know. How do I prepare for the next worst thing?
Thank you again very much for your talk. Pardon me. I have a question about one of the words that you've used quite a few times, envision. And it strikes me that for this society in particular, visual literacy, vision is a key word, obviously, and envision is a slightly different word, maybe a significantly different word. And so I would just love to read this little quotation from your talk that struck me. If we can envision it, we can build it. And I'm wondering, how does that relate to visual literacy as a phrase? Maybe it creates a new phrase, in visual literacy, and I certainly had never thought of in visual literacy, and it may be very awkward grammatically sounding, but I'm wondering, what would you think in terms of envisioning versus vision? What are the significant differences there?
is there a different kind of literacy for envisioning as opposed to visual?
So I think envision is closer to imagine,
Yeah.
but the problem if you use imagine and you say imaginary, it sounds like something you can never do. Or envision is something that you can see, and then you bring people together that can make it happen. So one of my strengths in my career has not been the person that makes it, but I can envision it over, let's say, lunch or a napkin, and then I can bring together resources and people that then can step by step make it happen, which is very similar to visualize. But envision seems more that I'm going to start the process of bringing together the parts that are then going to produce it. And it won't be imaginary. Although I'd like to imagine it, I want to actually get someone to, like the military, to contract it, provide requirements, and then as soon as possible we want to create a product that we can release that helps people. Just like the model we use to look inside the body has been used on over 200,000 patients. So we envisioned that we could do this back in 1992. But in 20 years, there's been 200,000 people that have been helped by it. So the notion that we can take these things and make them a reality. But I'm intrigued, so I took some notes. So I'm going to go back and look at some definitions. So this is what I'm telling you off the top of my head. But to be frank, it's a good question. So rather than just saying, here's the answer, I'm going to go back and play with it, because I did struggle with it during this talk, and I went through a number of different changes here in what words I was going to use, and I didn't want to start inventing words in a group that have been, like, even visual literate. Like last week at the conference I was at, someone used visual learning. But all these words have stuff associated with them in histories, so I want to be careful about it.
Thank you for the talk, and thank you for all the work that your colleagues do. My question is a little more on philosophical nature. The fact that a lot of your work and research that is done comes as a result of injuries and war, and the Defense Department has unlimited budgets. It's good. I was a patient from an accident 50 years ago, and the surgeon who did my reconstructive surgery got his training in World War II. A great surgeon. And I wonder how you juxtapose that, that war causes those things, and it's a good thing it helped me, although in the end result it made me well enough to go fight more. How you justify that or work through all that with, you repair people and then in the military, and obviously there always will be war, creates those injuries. How do you deal with that?
That's a good question. So people have always, since the Greeks, said that if you want to be a surgeon, you go to war. And war is this unfortunate opportunity that creates the need for a new innovation, which has always been the case. And one of the problems is that when we forget about the war, then we forget about supporting it. So we've had a lot of support for regenerative medicine, for instance, and hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars for brain injury. And there is ethical issues that a lot of doctors don't like to work for the Defense Department. I always see it as a coin with two sides. One side is weapons, one side is the wounds that we treat. And if you know a lot about the wounds that we treat, you also know a lot about the weapons. So are you willing to help the military better design their weapons if you know their wounds? And that's an area that gets really touchy. It's even further than your question. That some of us sit on committees, like myself, where we sat with generals looking at not just treating the injuries, but creating the injuries. So that's been a dilemma going back to the Greeks. And the fortunate part is most of modern medicine and what you see in modern medicine is funded by the military more than NIH or anything else. A huge amount, which is good. It's unfortunate that wars had led to all of this work. And that's the reality that we face. And I think there are ethical dilemmas here with that. I've somehow looked in the mirror and decided that I can accept it, but I find lots of people that would not accept it. I just felt that to treat these wounds, the more I knew about the weapons, so if I was going to treat that you had flu or Ebola, I'd want to know as much as I could about the virus. So when I treat somebody with an IED or an EFD or some other new weapon system, the more I can know about it, the better I'm going to treat that person. But to know about that, you end up rubbing elbows with people that are causing the injuries. And some of those people you have a lot of respect for, some you don't. But it's, again, it's like a lot of the things I talked about, there are ethical dilemmas to deal with. And I have a whole talk just on war and the revolution in military affairs that have led on to the revolution in medical affairs, because they go hand in hand. So you can look at a revolution in military affairs that changed the way we fight wars, and then see a revolution in medical affairs as a response to that. And you can track that through history and see what goes on, which is fascinating, although troublesome. The most troublesome thing is trying to find any period of time in the last several thousand years we weren't at war with somebody.
Yes, I have one quick question, another question. Have you ever seen Woman Without a Face, film from the 1947, I think?
Yes.
Yeah. My question for you is, what are your thoughts on human clonation?
Human donation?
Clonation, which seems like the next step from what you've been talking.
So clonation would be that we would, there are a couple of different ways to do it. One way would be that every time someone is born, we clone another person as a donor person for that person. So as there exists, we would be able to take parts off of them. And there are movies made about that as well. Because in your movie, he just kept stealing women and using them to reconstruct his daughter. So it's a great French movie. Eyes Without a Face. And I always like the French movies because at the end the dogs eat the scientist. I don't want to ruin anything for you. It's still a good movie to see. So people have talked about, well, don't do that, just I'll clone a match of you. But then the problem is, what rights does the clone have of you? So assuming that you can create a clone, for instance, without a brain, that would just survive, then you would have an ideal situation for a major reason. And the major reason the clone would have your exact immune system. So one of the big problems with these face transplants and other transplants right now is immune rejection. So we have to put them on a pretty complex protocol to block their immune system so they don't reject the face. And a lot of these keep trying to reject, and we keep changing the regimen or protocols, which is an ongoing problem. And then there's a lot of secondary effects with losing your hips and having infections and skin cancers by being on these immune drugs. So if you could do the cloning, there's big advantages to you. Plus you could make a clone with a face that was almost identical to yours, whereas right now the face we're going to give you, if you lose your face, would be very different. But ethically, there's going to be a lot of people that think it's wrong to create a match of you that's only purpose is to give its face, even if we designed it that it didn't have a brain. Certainly if we gave it a brain, then people would say that it would have rights, and therefore you couldn't use it. So it would make another good French movie.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll have one question over there, and then what I'd like to do is to invite anybody else to come up to Joe afterwards, so we keep everything on schedule. So please go ahead.
Okay. You talked about creativity in the medical field and your field, and what was your opinion on incorporating creativity, art, in the medical field so that doctors, like, under a lot of stress and stuff, don't have nervous breakdowns, because I think art and creativity is really important, and it's a really stressful field. And so what do you think about including creativity and art with medical?
So there's the father of plastic surgery was a fellow named Sir Harold Gillies. And he was very creative in a lot of ways. And he was also a master painter. Showed in London in many exhibits and things. He also fished and did a number of other things. He also was a great prankster. So he was creative in many different parts of his life, and had a great sense of humor about those things. So I think that I find a lot of surgeons have art backgrounds. I've done a lot of sculpture and other things in my career too, which I think is a great break for me. But let me tell one short story about Sir Harold Gillies to finish, which will be really great, which may screw up these microphones. But so Harold Gillies would create flaps would move around the body, and during World War I, a lot of people would lose their nose and stuff. So what he would do is create a flap that he'd move up from the body, and he'd hang on the nose like this before he'd make it into a nose. So these people would have this flap of tissue hanging like this. So he finished one of these in 1919, and the guy disappeared. So in 1950, 30 years later, the guy comes into Sir Harold Gillies' office with this nose, and says to Sir Harold Gillies, "Can you make me a nose so I look normal now?" And Gillies says, "Well, I'm happy to do it in exchange for one thing." He says, "What?" He says, "What have you been doing for 30 years?" He says, "Well, I've been an elephant man in a circus traveling all over Europe making a living, and now I want to retire." So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe. Just to send you on your way to the various places.